Alright, looks like we're in finally. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for this week's video, which would have come out a couple days sooner, but I unfortunately ended up getting a little bit of a cold bug, so I'm kind of dealing with that right now. And the past 2 days I was not really feeling up to the task. So, for our last video for July, because I will not be doing one next week due to a trip that I have, we are doing our president video for the month. And our president video for July of 2024 is the 23rd President of the United States, Mr. Benjamin Harrison, which has a relationship, yes, to the 9th President, William Henry Harrison, which that was his grandfather. They are the only grandfather-grandson pair of presidents. Which we'll go in, not massively in depth here, but we'll go a little bit into. So I don't think I need much of a reminder how these videos go, but for anyone that is watching one for the first time, of course, we go through a little bit of we just kind of go through the summary of their life. We go through a little bit of their, how they grew up, how they got involved in politics, or what they did before they were president, and then we get involved into, of course, going through their presidency and a little bit into their after years until their death or current day, if we ever get there. So for the week, not for the week, but for Benjamin Harrison, he is our 23rd president from 1889 to 1893. He was born on August 20th of 1833 in North Bend, Ohio. He grew up on his father's farm. John Harrison was his father, who was the son of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president. He grew up on his father's farm near the Ohio River outside Cincinnati. Of course, as we mentioned, grandfather William Henry Harrison, and by extension, William Henry Harrison's father, which would be Benjamin's great-grandfather, had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So he has his roots in American history. Growing up as a young boy, I believe Benjamin was 7 years old. Yes, I believe he was 7 years old when his great-grandfather took office and then died within a month. So young Ben, was alive at the time of his grandfather's brief presidency, and did have a couple of memories of it, I'm sure. In 1852, Harrison graduated from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He married shortly after Caroline Lavina Scott in 1853, and they would end up having 2 children. He would also study law in Cincinnati shortly after leaving Miami University. In 1854, Harrison moved his family to Indianapolis, Indiana, in order to set up a law practice there. And this also comes in conflict a little bit with Ohio, because Ohio does claim Benjamin Harrison as a Buckeye president because he was born and raised here, and up until his early 20s, he did live here. But he ultimately chose, by the time he was elected president, Benjamin Harrison was living in Indiana. He was an Indiana president, technically, when he was elected, but Ohio counts him because he was born and raised here. Excuse me. So he moves to Indiana, in order to set up a new law practice. Now, Harrison's father, John, would urge young Benjamin to stay clear of politics. Mostly, that probably had something to do with the way that, unfortunately, Harrison's grandfather had done, which was John's father. They probably looked at William Henry Harrison, who had started off as a military general and then kind of got gradually pulled into politics, and ultimately Harrison died while he was involved in politics. And I think that left a mark on John, that his dad had that happen. So he advised his own son, stay clear of it. Don't get involved in politics. It's a drug that you'll never get rid of, and it just brings nothing but misfortune to you and your family. So his own father kind of urged Benjamin, stay clear of the political realm. Don't get involved in politics. It's not worth the trouble. Where his wife, Caroline, would often encourage his political ambitions more often than not. Now, Harrison would end up becoming active in state politics. He would join the new Republican Party in the 1850s as he gradually did defy his father's words, and he very much identified with the anti-slavery cause as that came to light in the 1850s. That was something that Harrison very much felt was wrong in his own mind. He did not believe that slavery was in any way warranted, that it was any way just or proper, and that very early on put him going into line with the whole anti-slavery Republican cause in the 1850s as the Republican Party is starting to really take off on its own. So that is where Harrison's going to become politics is in the 1850s. Harrison would support Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont in 1856 and Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So he very early on starts really going with the Republicans. And the two presidential elections before the Civil War where there was a Republican candidate, that is who Harrison votes for. Of course, we know in 1860, Abraham Lincoln managed to win that election, and that leads to the Civil War. And that leads to another chapter in Harrison's life when that breaks out. So the Civil War starts up in 1861 when the Southern states begin to secede from the Union, and ultimately Southern forces fire on Fort Sumter, and that sparks a whole conflict right there. I think most of us know that. So Harrison, like many young men of his day, decides that it is his patriotic duty as an American to defend the Union and to come to the aid of the federal government in putting down this rebellion against the constitutional democratic government that had so long persevered. So, like many young men, he ends up volunteering. He joins the Union Army in the in the 70th Indiana Volunteer Infantry in 1861. He joins it as a lieutenant, and he would serve throughout the Civil War. He would actually take part in many of the campaigns of General Sherman's march into Georgia in 1864 along the Kennesaw Mountains. And by the end of the war in 1865, Harrison would attain the rank of brigadier general by the end of the war, which brought a whole military experience in and makes Harrison, again, another president who was a Civil War veteran. He had served in the Civil War and thus had some experience from that end. Let's see here. Early photos that maybe we can show of him from this time. Here is a very early picture of young Benjamin. This is around 1850, so about the time he's attending Miami University. This would be him. Very young age at that point. He's already starting to grow a beard that he would very much keep for the rest of his life. Here we have a picture of Harrison at the end of the Civil War in 1865 with the 20th Corps. He is all the way over here on the left. This is Harrison at that time in his Civil War uniform. And then I think, yes, I have it right here. Here is a picture of his wife, Caroline, who they would end up having 2 children together. We have that. So after the Civil War, Harrison would return to Indianapolis and then decide to continue his law practice and political career. Upon returning to Indiana, he would campaign unsuccessfully for the Republican gubernatorial nomination of Indiana in 1872, which he lost out on. He did not get the Republican nomination that year to run for governor. However, he would win the governor nomination in 1876, but then lost the actual election in a close race. So in 1872, he tries to get the Republican nomination to be governor of Indiana, be their candidate for that. He does not get the nomination, but in 1876 he does, only to actually lose the general election that year. But at this point, he's actively trying to run for public office, and no doubt using his connection to his grandfather before him and his great-grandfather and his military service, using that as kind of a springboard a little bit to get on there with the political field. So from 1881 to 1887, Harrison ended up serving as a U.S. Senator from Indiana. While in the Senate, he argued for the rights of homesteaders and Native Americans against the railroads at the time, which was kind of an outspoken viewpoint at the time for a U.S. Senator to really be in favor of, the homesteaders and the Native Americans instead of the big railroads that were supposedly bringing progress to the country. And he would also campaign for generous pensions to be given for Civil War veterans during his time as a U.S. Senator for Indiana. Being that he was highly religious and principled, he would also oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which most Republicans at the time had actually supported, as Harrison argued that it violated an earlier treaty with the Chinese that allowed them to allow Chinese immigrants to come in freely to the country and have a relative safe and secure path to getting citizenship once they came over. Now, that measure did ultimately pass. It's just Harrison kind of was an outspoken voice of criticism within his own party, which had largely voted for it. Now, when Democrats ended up sweeping the Indiana elections in 1887, Harrison lost his Senate seat that year. The following year, in 1888, Republicans decided to nominate him for president. And Harrison, while he was doing his presidential campaign, he largely did not really travel. He was probably, it's something that today we don't really think about. We think, okay, when somebody runs for president, of course they travel. They got to give speeches and rallies everywhere, and they got to hold events in numerous states, in numerous locations. And you would think if somebody sat on their butt today and sat at home and ran their whole campaign from their house, there ain't no way that they deserve the presidency, because what do they think? They don't have to work for it? Well, back then you could do that. And that wasn't a problem with voters back then. It was largely the party that would get your name out there and get your political viewpoints and your political standing out to the general public. It was not so much you. And Harrison, during his presidential campaign in 1888, he decided that he would largely run a front porch campaign. He ran it mostly from his own house. He did not travel around the nation. Instead, he would give speeches to crowds and delegations that would come to visit his home in Indianapolis. And in the 1888 election, as we discussed kind of in the last video, but this is just kind of a recap of that, Harrison ended up losing the popular vote to incumbent Grover Cleveland. He did not win the popular vote it was well over by 90,000 votes. It was not close. But he did carry the Electoral College, which, as we know, the Electoral College is what decides who wins the election, and thus, because he won the Electoral College, Harrison did beat incumbent Grover Cleveland and got a term in office. So the key swing states during that election were New York and Indiana. Indiana was no doubt helped by the fact that Harrison had been, a U.S. senator from Indiana, had been involved in Indiana politics. So the tally from the 1888 election here is right on this one. I'm not really going to, I think the last one we put what the popular vote was, but on the electoral count, it was 233 to Harrison and 168 for Cleveland. And here we have the electoral map of what that looked like. Harrison ended up winning it in electoral votes, but not in the popular vote. And Cleveland, at least for this time, got defeated on a second term bid. He would eventually come back. And here we have a picture of Harrison's inauguration on March 4th of 1889. And it's kind of hard to see in this photo, but right here would be Harrison on this side of the podium. And the guy holding the umbrella above his head, that is Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was holding Harrison's umbrella for him at the inauguration. So Harrison comes into office March 4th, 1889, into his term of office that he has won, and he immediately faces the after effects of an economic depression that has troubled the nation for the past year, and kind of in a way led to the downfall of Cleveland's initial bid for re-election, because people kind of blamed his policies in some way for causing that economic downturn. Now, Harrison was very much a protectionist in policy. He believed that the United States' economic interest took precedence over anything globally or anything like that. And as a protectionist, he wanted to supported the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 that had been proposed by Ohio Congressman and future President William McKinley. Now, Congress subsequently collected, with the McKinley Tariff Act, would collect over $1 billion in tariffs for the first time during a peacetime era. And this Tariff Act was not really popular with the majority of Americans, because many of them who thought that the president and his party were favoring the wealthy and big business by supporting this Tariff Act, because guess who gets a majority of the money? The big businesses did, that were getting profit off of this. Not so much the downturned consumer that were getting hurt in the market. Harrison would also lent support and backing to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that would come about in about 1891 or 1890. I want to say it was about 1891 that it came about. But the Sherman Silver Purchase Act came about, and what it did was required the government to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver a month in order to use that silver to mint coins. used for the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Mint. And what this bill did was pretty much served the constant harassment and political interests of the large silver mining interests out in Nevada and Arizona, which at this time in the American West, silver is the big metal. They don't really want the United States, they want the United States government to buy silver from them, so this act was a big win for them, because now they are making a killing, because the government has to buy almost 5 million ounces a month of silver in order to use under this act. And for these big silver mining interests out west, this is a big boon in business. And during this time, he would also sign the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would seek to try to start breaking down on the monopoly trusts that are starting to emerge in the United States in the 1890s. And this would prohibit those industrial combinations or trusts. All of these acts had been basically put forward by the Ohio congressman and close confidant of Benjamin Harrison, and that was Ohio Congressman John Sherman, which is, if I can find the photo I have him, this is John Sherman, who authored both of the acts, and Harrison very much worked with very closely during his term in office to get legislative packages through. And here we also have a picture of a campaign ticket from the 1888 campaign of Harrison and his vice presidential candidate, and then Vice President Levi Morton. Now, Harrison, while president, also continued his support for veterans' benefits. He did advocate forest conservation as well, and for an expansion of the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy was probably one of the few things him and Cleveland actually agreed on, because if you remember, Cleveland actually had kind of sponsored an expansion of the U.S. Navy early on. Him and Arthur both had. And Harrison very much was still in line with that line of thinking that the U.S. needed a stronger Navy, and kind of kept that going. Now, Harrison's foreign policy was very much showing a growing American influence in global affairs. At this point, the United States is not yet a world power, but it is on the path to becoming one. It's still in that period where it's starting to emerge as a dominant power on the globe. At this point, the United States is very much the most powerful regional power in North America, but it is not yet on the global stage. Not yet, but it soon will be in just a very short period of time. The first International Conference of American States, or the Pan American Union, would take place during Harrison's presidency in Washington, D.C. in 1889. And during his time in office, the State Department would negotiate a successful set of terms with Great Britain and Germany for an American protectorate in the Samoan Islands in the Pacific, which is kind of where American Samoa comes from, that we still have today. And Harrison his foreign policy, opposed Britain and Canada in the over-harvesting of seals in the Bering Sea, which is kind of on the conservation side that Harrison was a little bit leaning toward. And however, despite these successes, Harrison also had several flounders in his foreign policy. Most notably, he failed to convince Congress to back the construction of a canal in Nicaragua, which eventually we would have one put through Panama. The idea was to put a canal through Central America connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. Harrison tries to get them to back one in Nicaragua, but eventually Congress decides, no, we're not backing such a project, and decides against it. That'll change in about 10 years when Theodore Roosevelt is president. And Harrison, as we kind of mentioned in our last video here, Harrison was kind of the president that was somewhat willing to consider efforts to annex Hawaii after the native Hawaiian monarchy had been overthrown and the Hawaiian Republic the self-proclaimed Hawaiian Republic had expressed a wish to be annexed by the United States. And Harrison was very much for annexing Hawaii, unlike Cleveland, who would very much come out against it. However, when Harrison came up for re-election in 1892, he was faced with growing populist discontent, which was discontent mostly with his policies that they thought favored the big rich and big business, big wealthy people, the big wealthy corporate interests. They viewed that Harrison had been kind of a tool of these interests and that he was not on their side. So there's a big populist discontent against him, and labor strikes that are also going to occur. In the 1892 election, as we well know, former President Cleveland decides that he is going to run again, try again against Harrison for a second term. And in 1892, he decides, yeah, this is my time. So Cleveland runs against him, and there's also the Populist Party that comes in as a third-party bid to come in for president. And Harrison's campaign takes a hit during the election campaigning season because Caroline ends up becoming gravely ill, and Harrison can't really go out and campaign because he's constantly tending to her side because of her illness, and he scales back campaigning in key states because of Caroline's illness, and she eventually died in October of 1892. So just before the election had happened, Caroline ended up dying, and Harrison was definitely not the psychological or mental state to really go out and start campaigning for election after he just lost his wife. So in the 1892 election, Harrison, of course, does lose his re-election bid. He does not get a second term in office, and he loses to Cleveland, who he had beat 4 years earlier. The electoral count being 145 for Harrison and 277 for Cleveland. And here we have a picture of President Harrison in 1889 with Secretary James G. Blaine, and Representative Henry Cabot Lodge off the coast of Maine. This was them on a yacht. Here is President Harrison at the time. And one of the nicknames that Harrison kind of had during office was he was called the human iceberg because he was not the most talkative individual. He was not the most friendly up front when you would just meet him. Now, once you got to know him, yeah, he was friendly all the time, but outward appearance, he just seemed to be very cold and very, not really someone you wanted to just approach all the time. And here we have the USS Texas from 1892. This was the first battleship of the U.S. Navy. It was constructed during Harrison's term in office as part of President Harrison's naval expansion of the U.S. Navy. And here we have a picture of Harrison's home in Indianapolis, where he lived before he was president, and he would ultimately return to once he left office. So after leaving office on March 4th of 1893, Harrison ended up returning to Indianapolis and his law practice. He decided that, I might not be president anymore, but at the same time, I feel as though I don't want to retire. I don't want to really be done with this. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go back to just being a lawyer. We'll stay there. We won't diversify. We aren't going to try to run again against Cleveland because he didn't really have the interest in it. And then perhaps one of the oddest moves that I think Harrison did during his lifetime, this was definitely quite the odd move for him. In 1895, at the age of 62, he remarried to his wife's niece slash caretaker, Mary Dimmick. And Mary Dimmick was quite young when he married her. He was 62, and I want to see here, because I did not write her age down, but I am going to look. What age was she? She was 25 years younger than him when he married her in 1895. So that's a little bit suspicious, a little bit odd, and the fact that it is your wife's niece is kind of a little disturbing in my eyes, that he would go ahead and marry her. And what makes it even more disturbing is after they got married, he did end up having one child with her, which is a little even further disturbing that Harrison would even go down that route. In 1898, Harrison served as the lead counsel for Venezuela in a boundary dispute with Great Britain at the time, mostly with the British territory of Guyana, which, if anyone has noticed today, has never really been solved because Venezuela is still in a constant border dispute with Guyana over who actually kind of controls, over not really who controls, but over what territory is rightfully Guyana's and what is Venezuela's, and there's an ongoing dispute there. But this is a problem that has existed for years, and back in 1898, when this was a British territory and Venezuela was having another conflict with that, Harrison was actually sent as kind of a lead counsel for Venezuela in this boundary dispute to act on their behalf. And Harrison was largely kept to himself a little bit during his private life after he left office. Eventually, he would end up passing away at home in Indianapolis on March 13th of 1901, ironically, of the same thing that had killed his grandfather. His grandfather, of course, had died in office of pneumonia back in 1841, and Benjamin would also die of pneumonia himself, although in old age and not president anymore. He was retired at that point. But he himself ended up dying of pneumonia at age 67 I think his grandfather had been 68 when he had died, but he ended up passing away of pneumonia at age 67 when he was at home in Indianapolis on March 13th, 1901, which ended Benjamin Harrison's life. So again, this was Benjamin Harrison. Again, and not the most memorable president. There is a large part why I think he gets forgotten today, because some presidents, they're just very lackluster, like him and Grover Cleveland. The only reason Grover Cleveland is somewhat remembered is because he is the only president so far to have gotten 2 terms that weren't consecutive, but that's what makes him stand out. And then we have Benjamin Harrison, who just kind of comes in. He's sandwiched in between the guy that got 2 non-consecutive terms, and his 1 term in office isn't really all that spectacular in many ways compared to somebody like William McKinley or Theodore Roosevelt who are coming up. And there's a whole bunch of accomplishments that they have that go on that very much make them noteworthy of mentioning. But that, I think, concludes for this video. That's all I think we have for this one. This is not the longest video for our president one. I think we usually go about at least 35 minutes or so, but not for this one. We didn't, which is probably all the better because I'm still dealing with this. But if anyone has any comments, any questions, anything that they want to add, feel free to put them into the comment section below, and I'll be happy to go through them. If anyone has any suggestions right now, it'd be a good time to put them in. If anyone has any topics that they would like to see covered or like to hear about, feel free to make any suggestions in there as well, and I'd be happy to go through those as well, because as of right now, I don't fully have a lineup, I think, of what I'm going to cover in August. But so right now is like a perfect time. If anyone has any suggestion, put it in, because I will be happy to consider it at this point. I think at this point we only have 1 topic so far that's definitely guaranteed that we'll talk about in August. But we'll get to more of that when it comes. So that concludes for this video. So like, subscribe, comment, suggestions, everything like that. And we'll go through that when we can. So there will not be a video next week. It'll be 2 weeks from now that we do another one, because I will not be home next week, so we're not going to do a video. So until 2 weeks from now, hopefully everyone stays good and healthy and stays well. Hopefully I get over this, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when that comes out here in 2 weeks. So until then, everyone stay safe.